Well, I am very, very humbled to have the opportunity to teach. A lot of what I've come up with for you has come because this last year has been probably the most challenging year that I have experienced in ministry. And I thought, with the theme being I saw the Lord, based on Isaiah 6, I began to think about it's so easy to be overcome with the problems of dealing with difficult people that it overshadows what your intention is in ministry. I'm just curious to know, how many of you are in some form of ministry? A lot of you. I want to actually have a prayer with you at the end of class. We'll just do it for the entire class, but I want to have a prayer specifically for you. I want to start with 3 scenarios. I would like to tell you that these scenarios are just made up, but they are not. First one. Small church, less than 100 people. And the men that are serving as elders are old. They're older in years. And because they are, it's difficult for them to really perform the task of that ministry. So the deacons, which, by the way, the Bible gives no indication that they have any kind of authority. They're servants. I mean, we all are servants. But these churches have given the deacons almost elder-like authority. So, seeing that there's a need of understanding what these ministries involve, what is the role of an elder? What is the role of the evangelist? What is the role of the deacon? You begin a series to teach that from the Bible point of view, and now you've made some people angry. You've made some people angry enough that now there's an effort to try to get the preacher either to quit or to be fired. And I ask the question, what do you do? Second scenario. You have a husband and wife. The husband actually does a lot of work for the congregation. He has a servant heart. He really is devoted to works of ministry. But his wife has a history of divisive conduct. And there might be some mental issues, but there is a long history of this wife. When she's by herself, I don't know if she gets overcome of loneliness or what it is, but she begins sending barrage of texts to people. And some of the texts are not appropriate. There's even an instance where the preacher gets sent a text right before he's getting ready to go to worship. And honestly, the situation has hampered the husband's ability to be a leader in the congregation. But you also deal with some people that have opted to leave the congregation to go somewhere else because of the problems that this has that has developed as a result of this. So again, I ask you the question, what do you do? Third scenario. You have a change in eldership. And sometimes a person that has the appearance of being strong in the Bible, sometimes you discover that there is something about them that doesn't qualify them or that they don't really have a full understanding of what their ministry is. And I know we have the qualifications of eldership in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 and 1 Peter 5. And I actually tell people that are looking at being an elder, you need to get in there and read Ezekiel 34, because Ezekiel 34 actually tells from God's viewpoint that the eldership is so serious that God does not take it lightly when your shepherds are not ministering to the flock. But you have this situation, they're placed in an eldership, and sometimes it's because they are a large family. In other words, there's a family dynamic that runs the church. I hate to say that, but that's the way it feels. And they're one of the largest monetary contributors to the congregation as well. So how do you effectively move them out of that leadership position without causing conflict? I don't know that you can. But unfortunately, and sometimes to the unawareness of the church congregation, there's conflict between the preacher and the elders that can't be resolved. And I ask the question, what do you do? When I graduated in 2013, I'm going to tell you, and I'm sure a lot of you felt this way as if you were students here and ready to go on. Well, I was ready to go change the world. I mean, I was fired up. I mean, everything that we learned, I was ready to share that with people. And the enthusiasm was beyond limit. But it didn't take very long in ministry to realize that the people that you're ministering to don't share that enthusiasm. They don't care that you have had the biblical training you have. They're more intent, and we've heard this in this workshop, they're more intent on keeping things the way that we always do them, tradition. They're intent on trying to dictate what they think you should be doing, as if they have a better understanding of ministry than you do. I don't know if you guys ever experienced this, but how many times when you teach from the Old Testament do you get those people that say, we shouldn't be spending this much time in the Old Testament. It's not valid for us anymore. And we're hearing that within the church. I think it's amazing to me that we expect to have a lack of receptivity by people that don't know God. But we're finding that in the church. Sadly. How do we keep our focus on our ministry when you're buried with these kinds of things? Now, I need to qualify something before we even begin. We're going to go through some Bible people that experienced work with difficult people. And I'm going to address some keys to help us in those periods of time when the ministry gets hard. But I need to emphasize this. Preachers are not perfect. And sometimes the pressure of ministry can get to be so much that we lose the aspect of what we're about. And sometimes we as preachers can act unchristlike because we get frustrated, because we get discouraged, and the human nature of us comes out in those periods of time that we don't act like Christ. We can almost become in a condition where we become hardened too. Sometimes it's the preacher that maybe needs some changing. And I think that's where I want to focus our attention on, because We can't have the ability to change anybody. God's word can, but we cannot. The only person that we can change is us and how we do things. So let's take a look at some Bible examples of people that had difficult ministries. I'm going to start with what I call the patient one, Moses. It's said in the scriptures that Moses was the most humble man that ever walked the face of the earth. And yet, as he's entrusted with the task of leading God's people out of bondage into the promised land, he is faced with an overbearing task of leading all of these people. And all of these people are not as excited about God as Moses is. And even some of those challenges would be from his own brother and sister, and even from his own family, like Korah and the rebellion, and constantly dealing with people that don't like their situation, and they're not shy in expressing their grievances to Moses, even to the point sometimes where they're ready to even kill Moses because they're so frustrated. And so it's in those moments that you read in the scriptures Moses' plea to God when he says, "Yet now, if you will forgive their sin," and he's talking about the situation with the golden calf, but he says, "If not, blot me out of the book that you've written." Why? Because he understood how tough it was to lead. Later on, he would say, "Therefore I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you and that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people." I'm not doing this for special favors or because I'm enjoying this. I've been appointed by you to do this. And later on, when that task became so heavy, Moses said, "Why have you afflicted your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me?" Do you hear his frustration? Do you remember when Jethro suggested to him, "You find some other leaders because the task is going to be too heavy for you to bear alone"? You're seeing that, especially in the book of Numbers. He goes on, "Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to your fathers? Listen to this, I am not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me." You ever felt that way? I have felt that way. And it's important that we remember something. Number one key, you need to stay close to God, even when the work is becoming discouraging. Do you know what the biggest difference was between Moses and the children of Israel? Moses spent time with God. He spent time in prayer. He spent time face to face speaking to him. He spent time fasting. He spent time growing in the Lord. And the people were dependent on him and not on God. And so you see a nation of people that are just kind of going through the motions of following and serving God. Moses was determined to do it. And so when the work, and it will, I don't care if it's a ladies' ministry, a preaching ministry, a servant ministry, I don't care what it is. There's going to be a point, if you're dealing with people, it's going to get frustrating, and we need to keep our focus on staying connected with God. Now we might say, well, Every form of work deals with people, right? You mean, you go to the restaurant, you work with people. You go to an office, you work with people. But there's a very big difference in ministry because you're working with the people in every state that they're in. And that is our work. We don't have computer work. I know we work on computers. That's not what I'm saying. But we work specifically in connecting with people, and that is our work. And that becomes frustrating when you're dealing with many different variants of maturity levels and people that have mental problems, and you have people that, this sister and this sister don't get along with each other, and violation of trust and all of these things. You're going to be dealing with every single one of those as a preacher. And it's going to be hard. And that's why I said, keeping close to God is hard sometimes, because as people, we want to become so focused on finding the resolution and why is this not working. And as we dig in that pit, we wallow ourselves into more despair instead of actually taking it to God and having God be our source of strength. Number 2, David. I call him the gracious one. He's called in 1 Samuel 13:14, a man after God's own heart. And I want to really focus on him, his life before he was king. God has rejected Saul as king because of his disobedience. And there's a point where Saul is envious of David. So much that now he's turned to a hateful violence towards David, wanting to kill him. And we're told in the scriptures there are at least 2 occasions in which David had a chance to kill Saul, and he wouldn't do it. And it wasn't because, David was this easygoing kind of guy. In fact, you read the story of Nabal and Abigail. David could be very hot-headed at times. He wanted to kill Nabal, and it was only through Abigail's intervention that spared his life. So David could be very hot-headed at times. But when it came to claiming the life of Saul, David chose the path of doing what was right. And that's number 2. You got to keep doing the right thing, even if others are not. You have to keep it. And the truth of the matter is, for those of us who are or have the biblical background that a lot of us have, we should be expected to be the ones to show people that don't know how to be like Christ. We have to set the bar. We have to set the example, because most people don't have the benefit of coming to Sunset or going to, another place that teaches them how to do ministry, including, unfortunately, our elders. Our elders are not even getting biblical training. And so the only person that can actually show them what it means to do Christ-like, to be Christ-like, is us. And yet, isn't it hard sometimes? Because the expectation seems to be set at a bar that just doesn't seem to be possible to reach. Because I've heard it said, everybody, the preacher has a small window of emotion that they're allowed to have while dealing with the full emotions of everybody else. So when you get angry, you just can't tell somebody off like the average church member can, because you're expected to be better. So when you lose your temper, all of a sudden, you're not Christ-like. And you see why that can be difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so important. We got to keep our focus on doing what we know is right. Number 3, Nehemiah. I want to tell you something. Honestly, I think Nehemiah is one of the most underrated men of faith we have in our scriptures. When we think about people who are men of faith, Nehemiah is not usually one that comes to mind. And this guy, all he did was build the wall. No, there's a whole lot more to Nehemiah than just that. Because he was there to help lead people to back into ministry for God. And part of that was indeed building the walls. And as they were doing that, they were faced with a lot of opposition and threats by these guys, Sanballat and Tobiah and some others. And yet Nehemiah is shown to be persistent. And in every case, you see these little quips about how he said a very quick prayer to God. I'll show you some of this. They faced taunting. In fact, when they started to build the walls, they started taunting them by saying, what are these feeble Jews doing? I mean, if a fox walked up on the wall, it would break it. What do they think they're doing? And in that moment, Nehemiah prays, "Hear, O God, for we are despised." What does he do? Turns it over quickly to God. So when that didn't work, they go to conspiracy. It says in Nehemiah chapter 4, when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored, all of them conspired together to attack Jerusalem and to create confusion. So what does Nehemiah do? Sit and complain? Say this is not fair? No. It says, we made our prayer to God. He turned it over to the source that could actually make a difference. So when that didn't work, then they started planning on trying to do harm to Nehemiah. So they say, "Hey, Nehemiah, come meet us over in the village." And it says, it's not in quotations, but it says what their intention was. They thought they would do me harm. So Nehemiah answers them saying, "I can't go to you because I'm a part of a great work, and I'm not going to set aside this great work to go spend time in some nonsense." And now that's the David Revised Standard Version, but you understand that's the intent of what he says here. But once again, in verse 9, we see what he does. "Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." Every case, this man of faith turned over every opposition, every conflict he was facing with these people over to God. Key to remember, we got to keep focused on the work of the Lord, the ministry that we are entrusted with, even when others are attempting to stop it. And I will tell you something, you will have church members that don't understand what you're about and what your intention is, what your purpose is. I'm going to tell you one of the biggest obstacles that at least churches in the north, I don't know about y'all down here in Texas, but I know the churches in the north this is to be true. You get this argument or this thought of we need to do more to reach our young people. Good, sounds good, doesn't it? But the minute you start suggesting, well, then let's start working in ministries and catering some of our worship even to include what they enjoy. Doesn't mean that we're doing something unbiblical, but sing some of the songs that they like. There's nothing bad with those songs, and you would not believe the kind of resistance that you face. Well, we can't do that. We don't know them songs, and especially on Sunday morning, if we ever have any guests, we need to be at our best, and the only way we can do that is by singing the old traditional songs. That's the mindset of people. And then they scratch their heads, and they wonder, well, why aren't we getting any of the young people? So there are people that will try to stop the work you're trying to do. We need to keep focused on the work. The work of ministry and actually the work of saving souls is more important than the comfort level of the people in our congregations. Even if they don't see that, it is. And as I said, this is hard and it's frustrating. Number 4, Paul and Barnabas. When you reach this part in their life, they have had just come away from a successful missionary work. They have won some souls, Acts chapter 14, but then they're faced with an opposition by the Jewish sect that is struggling a little bit with, what do we do with these Gentile believers? Because we're still dedicated to the old law, and they're not. So it is in the course of that they begin this Jerusalem council, and through the efforts of Paul and Barnabas and Peter and the Lord's brother James, they have a successful council. It all ends well, and even the Jews are now open to embracing the Gentile believers. You would think, boy, we've hit a home run here, right? We've overcome a pretty big struggle here, and yet right at the end of this, right at the end of the chapter, conflict, and this time it's with each other. Barnabas and Paul. Because it centers on John Mark. And I guess he had deserted them earlier in the ministry, and Paul was like, we can't take somebody that isn't dependable with us. But Barnabas, we find out, was related to Mark, and he's a little more willing to entrust him to come and be a part of this. And so they agree to go their separate directions. And there are times in ministry where that's going to happen. It's going to be time to separate. But I'm going to just emphasize this. We still need to keep our attention on the work of the Lord, even when we have to separate. I wish I could tell you, I've had a ministry that came to an end, and I wish I could tell you that we left best of friends, peaceably. They wished us well, we wished them well, and we moved on to our next ministry. But I am going to tell you, I didn't know leaders could act so ungodly. I didn't know that. But I saw it, and I learned it. I wish that the church and the people there would understand that, unfortunately, there will be times when there's a need to separate. It could be because of personal reasons. We have a situation coming up where our son's getting ready to graduate. He lives 13 hours away from us, and he's intending on staying in Oklahoma. My family live in St. Louis, and my mom's getting at an age where, we're starting to get a little more concerned with, what happens when she's not able to take as good care of herself. And my wife and I have had many conversations about, maybe it's time that we start focusing on being someplace where we can be of help and be a part of our son's life. So there are times when separation is for personal reasons. There are times when separation, and this is more common, when there are such theological differences to the point where you just cannot you can't coincide. And it's those times that seem to be more often than not. I know, because I've talked to people, from here at Sunset. Do you know the percentages of those that actually started in the ministry and stay in the ministry is very small? And it's because the work is hard. Working with people is hard. And you might actually be doing the right thing and doing staying close to God. And what you find is that the people that you love and the people that you minister, they're not growing. They don't even have a desire to. And so sometimes you have to actually look and say, I've done everything I know to do. And I don't know how to get them beyond what I've done. I've done my work. I've done it to the best of my ability. But in order for them to go beyond this point, they're going to have somebody else that knows something maybe I don't, that can better reach them. And sometimes that's just the way it is. So we need to stay focused on the ministry. Let me tell you something. Just because a bad ministry experience happens doesn't change the fact that there's still a need for ministry. Okay? And don't let one ministry experience that ended bad define what the work is in other places. Remember what Jesus said? You go to a place and they're not receptive, or you do what you can. You got to have the wisdom to know when it's time to shake the dust and move on. So let's talk about one last one. The focused one. Jesus. Do you think Jesus ever dealt with difficult people? You read about the account and it's amazing. There is so many attempts to hinder, and not just his ministry, but this was actually the eternal purpose of God. This is what he came to do. He got opposition from his own city. Remember what he said? A prophet is welcome anywhere except his hometown. He got it from his own family who thought he'd lost his mind. He got it from his own disciples. Remember when he told them his purpose, Peter pulled him off the side. Lord, I think you're kind of off base here, And quickly, I don't know if you ever said to somebody, get away from me, Satan. I don't know how well that would go if you tried telling somebody that in your congregation. But that's what Jesus said. Unfortunately, we don't even have people the depth of Peter a lot of times to say that to. But you know what? Jesus' focus was on redemption. That's what his whole focus was on. I've come to seek and save that which was lost. And then when he had the point, right at the last moment where he thought, he could make the decision, what could I do? His focus was not on himself, not on his personal achievements, agenda, but not my will, but yours be done. He stayed focused to the task. But he lived with difficult people. The Pharisees were not the only difficult people he worked with, by the way. But they were a primary people that caused him difficulty. But you look at the multitudes that came to him demanding his time, demanding him be gracious to them, even to the point of, healing every kind of case that they brought before him. They demanded that he exercise self-control. He was never able to lose his temper, although sometimes he did. I don't know about y'all, but when you have somebody walking in with a cord and turning over tables, I think that you could define as pretty mad. They demanded his compliance. Wasn't that the key to the whole Pharisaical opposition? You don't comply with our way. You don't look like us. You don't talk like us. You don't act like us. How can you therefore be the Messiah when you're not like us? And we get that mentality in traditional churches where we think sinners are supposed to look like us, act like us, and we think, But they're lost. How would they know how they're to act? And isn't that the essence of why they need the gospel in the first place? So Jesus becomes really the one we need to model the most. I think the others are great examples for us. In Moses, stay close to God, even when the work is discouraging. For David, keep doing right, even when others are not. Nehemiah, keep focused on the work, even when people are trying to stop it. And Paul and Barnabas, keep your attention on God's work, even when there's a need to separate. Now, in every single case, I've said, this is hard to do. Did you hear me? Yeah. But I never said it was impossible. I've never said it's impossible to do. I just said it's hard. And it's going to take determination. It's going to take a lot of time in prayer and spending time with God to get there. But it is not impossible to do. How do I know that? Because the man that said, God, this is too hard of a burden for me to bear, still led the people to the promised land. The one that said, I won't take a man's life, I won't take the Lord's anointed life, still became king. The one that said, I'm not going to take my focus off this great work, completed the wall, and then began the efforts of inspiring the people to get back to God, which they had not had since the time of the captivity. And even Paul and Barnabas, you know what that separation did? It allowed God to spread the gospel even further than what just the two of them staying together could. It's not impossible. I want to end our time. We've got about 5 minutes or so. Because I believe in the proverb that says iron sharpens iron. I'm curious to know, what are some things your congregation has done that has helped resolve conflict? Because I believe that we're in a situation that's not unique. We're all going to face something similar. And I think this would be a big help to those of us who might need maybe some encouragement in this area. What are some of the ways your congregation has helped resolve conflict?
There was a couple women in the congregation who had an argument or a disagreement that affected a few members of the church, but our elders and deacons, maybe deacons, might have just been the elders, were quick enough and swift enough that the conflict was solved pretty much immediately, and no one else in the congregation heard about it. So.
That would be a Syntyche and Euodia kind of situation in Philippians. These two dear ladies to Paul, where Paul says, you help them resolve this issue. And notice that was not a follow the Matthew 18 model. It was the church just needed to step up and get these two ladies to resolve. Others?
I think the key there was that they acted quickly.
They acted quickly, yes.
Actual relationships, which is surprisingly hard to do for a lot of congregations, help a lot. Quick story, one of my former elders in South Dakota got up, and he didn't mean this, but he basically implied that your kids need to shut up because it's disrespectful to God. That's not what he said, but it's what came out.
Okay.
A lot of the members who had kids came to me and said, what did he mean? I'm like, I'll talk to him about it. This was 3 years in my ministry, and one of the things that we did was I actually, not only did we have good elder meetings, but I got together with each of my 3 elders each week for coffee, they had us into their homes. I actually had a relationship with these guys. It wasn't business, it wasn't an employee. We were brothers first, and that's the way we operated, which I came later to understand is not very common. What I was able to do was basically confront him to his face, saying, here's what you did, here's how it came across. I know you didn't mean that because I know you, but here's what happened. Mm-hmm. And to his credit, he thought for a little bit, but I remember we were sitting in an elders meeting, and he got quiet for a second, and he goes, how do I fix this? And each of us just said, all right, next Sunday, get up, apologize, and it'll be fine. Next Sunday morning, he got up and said, I'm sorry for what was interpreted, not what I meant, of course. Please forgive me. Done. But from my next congregation, the unwillingness to be humble, the unwillingness to admit fault, the unwillingness to actually submit to relationship as opposed to position or feelings of self-entitlement, the rights.
Right.
So relationship, I think, is a large part of how conflict can be
Yeah.
dealt with quickly. But if you don't have that, then...
Well, and I think that demonstrates a level of maturity on this man's part. And I'm finding, probably just like you, that that's not very common. In fact, do you know what the hardest words for people in the church to say today? I'm sorry. They'd rather die than actually admit that they've done something to hurt somebody. Is that Christ-like? We're not perfect people, but I am amazed at how many people just can't admit, I was out of line here. They expect the preacher to do that. But, yeah. How do we remain Christ-centered in the midst of all of this? Yes, sir.
Funny, just back up just a second.
Sure.
I really truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in the wilderness as a preacher. Because you do take, we went through some discord, some disharmony, and I would absorb that to try to diffuse and try to help. Good or bad, that can be argued both ways, but you understand what it means to be up there when you're trying to preach unity.
Yeah.
And they're fighting with one another, and the anger and the refusal to say I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just permeates, and you're going right into the midst of it, going, that's enough. We've got to stop. And
Yes.
become a scapegoat as a preacher. You're the one saying, fine, I'm sorry. I don't know what was said.
Yeah.
Matter, really, it's not a salvation issue. Let's move on with our lives and go forward.
Yeah.
I found that's what I did, and that helped kind of diffuse, but also addressing.
Yeah.
Not by a letter, not by an email, not by a text, but just going to person to person to person.
Sometimes just saying sorry doesn't mean that it's an admission of wrong. Sometimes it's just an admission that somebody else was hurt, perhaps by the way they heard something. So, very good point. It looks like we're out of time, but I want to say a prayer, especially for those in ministry. So, would you bow with me, and we'll finish up this way. Heavenly Father, you have given us probably the toughest task there could possibly be in this earth, and that is the working with people in this role or this work that we call ministry. And Father, I know that most of us have probably cried out to you in despair and discouragement the way Moses did. We have probably had situations where things in ministry didn't end well, and yet we're to remain focused, and we're to remain focused on the work that you have given to us. I just pray for these men and women here today in whatever course of ministry they're at, whether it's a work of service to somebody, whether it's a ladies' ministry, if it's a preaching, teaching ministry, a missionary ministry, whatever it is. I just pray, Father, that they, first of all, would stay the course, even when the work gets hard. But I pray that we would remember the steps that these righteous men who dealt with conflict, what they did, and use them, their examples, to help us move beyond the things that we're seeing as conflict, and to help us move beyond that so that we stay focused on the souls of people who are lost. So we focus on the hurts and the needs that people have while showing them that you are the source. And so, Father, I pray for these ministers and all of these workers in the kingdom, that you would bear fruit in their ministry, and that there will be more joys than there are disappointments in the work. But we know, Father, that whatever it is we do, if we do a good work, we will be able to hear you tell us, well done, good, faithful servants. And that's my prayer for every one of us, that we will hear those words and enter into eternity. So help us endure. Help us to move beyond past hurts, past disappointments, and help us once again be focused on the most rewarding work we have, even in the difficulty. And that is preaching your word and leading others to Christ. And it's in his precious name we pray. Amen. Thank you for your time.